What if the company you trust every morning, the one behind your favorite bread, was built on a stolen recipe from a woman who biked to work for 10 years, and no one even remembered her name? This story begins on a quiet morning when a disguised CEO walked into the flagship bakery and met Mira, a silent baker who never spoke, never rested, and never asked for anything. But when Colton uncovered a buried truth, a stolen recipe, a lost brother, and a dream long forgotten, he had to make a choice: stay silent like every CEO before him, or speak up, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built. Graham Caldwell once died in a car accident, believing he was a failure. But today, the company that carries a different name was finally forced to bow its head and place his name on the wall. Chicago still lay fast asleep beneath a thick, icy fog as Colton Reyes drove his aging sedan through the silent blocks of Old Town. The clock on the dashboard had just ticked over to 4:43 a.m. No blinking traffic lights, no honking horns, only the dull yellow street lamps reflecting off misty windows. For most people, this was the deepest hour of sleep. But for Colton, it was the moment he needed to be most awake. He had changed his name, altered his appearance, stepped away from the tailored suits and leather chair on the 37th floor of his office to assume a new identity. Eli Moreno, a new trainee from corporate headquarters, assigned temporarily to support the flagship store of Maple and Sage in Chicago. No one at this bakery knew that the man who would be sweeping flour, mopping floors, and hauling trash alongside them today was, in fact, the CEO of the entire chain. And that was exactly how Colton wanted it. He parked his car 2 blocks away from the store, zipped his coat all the way up to his chin, pulled his cap low over his brow, and walked briskly under the faded glow of the streetlights. The cold hit him hard, but it wasn't the weather that made him shiver. It was the feeling of stepping into a world he had built, but no longer belonged to as its founder. That was why he was here. The revenue reports had shown an unusual plateau. Customer reviews remained strong. No complaints, no technical issues. But net profit had declined for 3 consecutive quarters. And Colton, once a firm believer in data, now believed in something else. Only by returning to where it all began could he understand why the bread he once crafted was losing its soul. The bakery sat on a street corner, beneath a 3-story red brick building. The wooden sign hanging above the frosted glass window still bore the line Colton had carved himself years ago: Maple and Sage, honest bread, honest hands. A warm light glowed behind the foggy glass. It meant someone was already in the kitchen. Colton's eyes widened slightly. 4:45 a.m., earlier than expected. He approached slowly, then paused. And that was the first moment he saw her. The woman who, in just a few weeks, would completely reshape the way he understood justice, creativity, and his entire company. In a kitchen filled with silence, broken only by the faint sound of dough being sliced, stood Mira Caldwell. She had no idea someone was watching from outside, no sense that she was about to become the center of a quiet revolution. She was simply doing the work she had done for the past 8 years. Her hair was tied up neatly, not a strand out of place. Sleeves rolled up to the elbows, hands moving with the kind of fluency that made it seem the dough was listening. She didn't check the clock. She didn't glance at a timer. But every motion had a rhythm. Colton stood frozen, transfixed. He had watched hundreds of surveillance clips from stores across the system, attended countless product demo meetings with the creative team, but never had he seen someone bake with such precision. He only looked away when the door creaked open. No bells, no chimes. A tall man in a brown uniform stepped out, bringing with him the warmth and smell of cinnamon butter from inside. "You must be Eli." Colton nodded, kept his voice low and clipped, like someone just off a red-eye bus. "Yup, just flew in last night. Appreciate you taking me in this early." The man extended his hand, his expression friendly but not overly warm. His name, Logan, was printed on the name tag pinned to his chest. He seemed to be the early shift lead. "Corporate trainees, huh? They keep sending you guys lately. Alignment check, SOP audit, product insight, whatever the excuse is this month." Colton smiled faintly and stepped inside. The cinnamon smell was stronger than he expected. Bolder, sharper, but not chemical. It was real. real cinnamon, real brown sugar, real butter. And in the kitchen, Mira continued working, as if the noisy world outside had never existed. "That's Mira," Logan said quietly, as though afraid she might hear. "She's, how do I say this? The heart of this place. Doesn't talk much. Comes in early, way before any shift starts. Sometimes I think she doesn't even leave." Colton gave a slight nod, eyes still fixed on Mira. "She always starts that early. Beats the sun. We don't ask questions anymore. She's been here longer than me, longer than almost anyone still left." Colton didn't reply, but his mind was already filled with questions. Logan led him around the kitchen, pointing out the equipment, the ingredient storage, the shift assignment board. But Colton was focused on one thing. Mira didn't use any measuring tools. No notes, no second opinions. She tested bread by the sound of its crackle, the color of its crust under the oven light, and for the first 20 minutes, she never once looked up. Colton couldn't help himself. He had to try speaking to her. When he was assigned to pull a tray of freshly baked goods from the oven, he moved toward her, keeping a respectful distance, and said, "Those smell insane. Are they your own recipe?" No response. He thought she hadn't heard. But when he set the tray down near her table, Mira tilted her head slightly, still not making direct eye contact, and said, "Don't talk to the dough while it's still listening." He froze, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. "Right. Got it." She said nothing else. But as he turned to leave, he was certain he saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Just a flicker. Almost nothing. But enough to tell him. She wasn't made of stone. By 7 a.m., customers began to arrive. Logan showed Colton how to operate the coffee machine, manage basic customer interaction, and restock pastry trays. Mira never left the kitchen. She didn't step out front. She didn't sign her name on the bestseller of the day board, even when customers asked for items by her name. She refused individual tips, declined photos with guests, even when they insisted. Colton asked Logan, "She doesn't want credit." Logan shrugged. "She doesn't want anything, doesn't ask, doesn't take, just bakes." The morning wrapped with a rush of customers, a large pre-order from a nearby company, and several trays selling out before 10 a.m. Mira still didn't stop. Colton went to the back to grab more ingredients. When he returned, he saw Mira silently wiping down the kitchen, carefully reorganizing every tray. A young employee dropped a sheet of unbaked dough. Mira didn't scold, didn't raise her voice. She simply bent down to help pick it up and said, "Accidents happen. The oven forgives if you respect the dough." Colton just stood there, feeling as if he'd stepped into a sanctuary. No sermons, but everything sacred. As the morning closed, Mira washed her hands, folded her apron, pulled a small cloth bag from the locker, and stepped out the back door. Colton stood nearby, watching. She didn't call an Uber, didn't take the train. She walked to a lamppost, unlocked an old rusted bicycle chained to its base, hooked the cloth bag to the rear rack, mounted it, and rode away, never once looking back. No one waved goodbye. No one stopped her. She left the way she lived, quietly, leaving no trace. Colton stood alone in the kitchen. He had seen enough to know this. In this world, there are people whose mastery is so complete that no rule seems to apply to them. But if they never speak up, no one will ever know their name. And Mira Caldwell was exactly that kind of person. Colton returned to the bakery the next morning, right on time as promised. 4:45 a.m., and the sky was still pitch black. He pushed the back door open so gently it made no sound. Inside, the soft yellow light from the recessed ceiling lamps fell over the kitchen like a stage with no audience. Mira was already there. She was kneading dough on the stainless steel counter, hands moving in steady rhythm, hair tied high and neat, apron the same old dark one, faded with traces of flour and butter. He stepped in quietly, set down his bag, said nothing. She didn't look up. No greeting, no acknowledgement. As if his presence had been absorbed into the space like the hum of a ventilation fan or the wind outside the door. A background detail, not worth breaking her focus. Mira kept working as if no one were beside her. She dusted the counter with flour, divided a large lump of dough into 8 equal parts without a scale, just by feel. Each piece was rounded in the palm of her hand and placed on the tray with instinctive precision. Colton watched in silence. This was his second time standing beside her, but it felt just like the first, as if he were watching a pianist without an instrument, only breath and memory. Around 5:10 a.m., Logan walked in, bringing the street's chill and the sound of the front door unlocking. He nodded at both of them. "Morning," he said, then turned to Mira. "We got a new local order for 15 chocolate croissants. Due by 8, Mira just nodded, asked nothing. She changed trays, wiped her hands on an old towel tucked into her waistband, and began a new batch, this time mixing dark chocolate shavings into leavened dough. Colton was assigned to help prepare tray liners and measure butter. He tried to match yesterday's pace but fumbled slightly as he slid the butter tray closer to Mira. A piece slipped off the edge, fell onto the floor. Mira said nothing. She simply paused, looked up at him for the first time that morning, stepped over, picked up the piece, set it aside on another tray, then looked at his hands. "You're gripping like you're apologizing to the tray," she said softly, gently adjusting his wrist. "Firm but not fearful. Dough doesn't like doubt." He laughed despite himself. "Guess I need to stop overthinking things." Mira tilted her head, not quite a smile, but there was a softness there. Dough can sense that too. They continued working. From a distance, Logan observed and shook his head slightly, murmuring to Zach, "That's the closest I've seen her interact with anyone before 6 a.m. Zach whispered back, "She hasn't even spoken to me outside of orders. That new guy must be a magician." By 6:30 a.m., Mira had finished the croissant batch. She didn't pause, didn't sip water. Monica, the morning manager, handed her a thin notebook. "We're starting the month-end reviews. You've got an anniversary next week, right? 8 years?" Mira didn't answer immediately. She looked at the notebook, flipped through a few pages, then handed it back. "I'd rather skip it. No celebration needed." Monica hesitated. "You sure? We were thinking of giving you a shout-out on social media. Maybe a framed photo, a little bonus." Mira interrupted, still gently. "Please don't. I'm fine as is." Monica said nothing more, only nodded. Colton watched all of it, didn't interfere. But in his mind, he was taking notes. Mira declined all recognition, avoided attention, rejected anything that might make her the center of focus. That wasn't humility. It felt more like a defense mechanism. At 7:15 a.m., a line of customers began to form outside. Mira didn't come out front. As the day before, she remained in the kitchen, kneading, rolling, placing dough into trays. Logan bounced between the kitchen and counter, while Colton handled coffee prep and simple customer interactions. That was when a frail old woman entered, slightly hunched, wearing a pale gray knit hat and holding a small bundle. Logan greeted her by name. "Morning, Miss Evelyn. Your usual." She smiled and nodded, but instead of waiting at the counter, she walked straight into the kitchen, something customers rarely did. Logan started to stop her, but she waved him off. "Just a second, dear." Mira looked up when she saw the woman's silhouette. Colton noticed. It was the first time Mira's gaze visibly softened for anyone. Evelyn pulled a faded, lace-trimmed silk handkerchief from a paper bag and said, "I kept this from when I was a girl. My mother used to make morning buns just like yours. The smell, the texture. It's her all over again. I wanted you to have this." Mira took it slowly. She looked at the handkerchief, then at the woman, and said softly, almost inaudibly, "Thank you." Evelyn just smiled, placing her hand over Mira's. "You remind me of someone who never needed attention to be remembered." When she left, Colton saw Mira fold the handkerchief carefully, placing it in her apron pocket. She said nothing more, but her expression had changed. Something in her eyes, as if a memory had just been tucked away, not discarded, but kept. At 8 a.m., the shift kicked into high gear. Mira became the invisible engine of the whole operation. No one gave her orders, yet everyone paced themselves to match her rhythm. Zach waited for her to place the first tray before starting. Amber, a new hire just 2 months in, didn't bother to hide her irritation. She passed Colton at the counter and muttered just loud enough for him alone to hear. "Don't know why everyone treats her like royalty. It's not like she talks to anyone." Colton said nothing, but Logan, standing nearby, had heard. He walked over, voice even. "She's earned the respect. Maybe when you've baked 3,000 perfect croissants without missing a shift, We'll throw a towel your way too. Amber flushed red and turned away. Mira seemed unfazed. She continued rolling dough, eyes fixed on her tray. Around 9:20 a.m., Colton was assigned to assist with kneading a new batch. He tried to match her technique, but gripped too tightly, tearing the dough. Mira silently paused, slid another piece toward him, placed it in his hands. Let it breathe. It's not an apology. It's a promise, she said, adjusting his hands. Right angle, right pressure. He nodded, and this time he got it right. She murmured, barely audible. Better. See? Doe listens. He looked at her a moment longer than necessary, about to say something, but she had already turned away. The morning shift ended at 11 o'clock. Staff began cleaning up. Logan organized the afternoon crew. Mira still hadn't rested. Monica reminded her, Take 10. You've been on your feet since 4. Mira simply replied, I'll sit after proofing. But after proofing never came. She continued wiping ovens, portioning dough, recording missing ingredients. Colton stood at the front counter, watching through the kitchen window. Mira, with her hair still tidy, back still straight, and hands still moving, was the embodiment of something nearly impossible to define. A person who asked for no reward, needed no recognition, yet held everything together with the quiet force of her presence alone. And he began to wonder, could someone like her have been overlooked by his entire system for 8 whole years? When Colton walked into the bakery that morning, the sky was just beginning to lighten. The early light wasn't yet strong enough to cut through the frosted glass at the front of the store, but inside, the warm yellow glow of the kitchen lights stretched across the space like an unchanging habit. Mira was already there, as always. No confirmation needed anymore. Colton greeted Logan with a nod and went straight into the small break room in the back, where a shared desk for the manager and supervisor sat. Monica hadn't arrived. The computer screen was still on, with a payroll spreadsheet left open. Colton hadn't planned on digging into anything, but Mira's name appeared right in front of him, Caldwell Mira, with a pale yellow note in the far right column that made him pause. The line read, Third-party deduction, Darrow Holdings, recurring. He clicked on it. Employee code, deducted amount, identical every month, unchanging for over 6 years. No additional descriptions. No one had touched that note since her first year on staff. A chill ran down Colton's spine, even though the heater in the room was running just fine. He had heard of Darrow Holdings, an emergency lending firm usually used by people turned away from traditional banks. High interest, vague contracts. Their customers were often low-income workers, desperate with no options left. But Mira, the one who worked from 4:30 a.m. until closing, who handmade bread that customers lined up just to touch, why would she ever need to borrow from a company like that? He closed the screen just as Monica entered the room. He adjusted his chair, picked up a folder like he was reviewing inventory forms. Monica greeted him with a polite smile and took her seat across from him. Colton acted as if nothing had happened, but in his mind he was already piecing together a broken picture. Mira didn't accept bonuses. Mira declined every proposed raise. Mira split tips evenly, even when customers insisted on tipping her alone. Mira arrived before every shift, and now Mira was making regular payments to a predatory lender. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a hole, a quiet injustice disguised by discipline and silence. The morning passed as usual. Mira didn't take breaks, didn't talk much, didn't hold anyone's gaze longer than 3 seconds. Colton, still going by Eli, was assigned to clean the oven and prep ingredients for the afternoon batch of savory pastries. But his thoughts kept circling back to Darrow Holdings. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, after the lunch rush, Mira entered the break room, quietly taking a printed shift calendar from the corkboard. Monica had stepped out to collect supplies. Colton stood behind the desk, pretending to check warehouse reports. Mira didn't seem to notice him. She picked up a pencil, drew a small line on the Friday evening shift, then hesitated before adding one for the following Monday. Colton didn't say a word, but he saw her eyes glance quickly over the schedule again. Then she crossed out both entries. She set the pencil down and stood still for a moment, as if battling herself. Then she pulled a phone from her apron pocket. Not to text, not to check the time, just to look. The screen was dark. She turned it on, not to open anything, but to stare at a faded old photo set as her wallpaper. It looked like a family picture, maybe someone she once lost. She stood there staring for a long time. A minute, two. Colton felt he shouldn't stay, but couldn't bring himself to leave either. There was something in that moment he couldn't ignore. Someone like Mira, who never backed down, who never stopped moving, now frozen in place over a shift that had been denied. She tucked her phone away, said nothing, and walked out as if she had never entered. Colton waited a few moments, then followed. That evening, he reopened the payroll file on his laptop at the temporary room he was renting. He read through early HR records from Mira's first years with the company. Every line, every time she had been recommended for promotion, and every time she had turned it down. Reason? Prefer to remain at current level. Another, do not want special consideration. He pulled up old customer feedback. One message was 3 pages long, a family thanking Mira for gifting pastries after the death of a loved one. Mira had never responded. She didn't want to be thanked. An employee like that would usually be celebrated, featured, placed on the company website. But Mira always seemed to step out of the light, not out of modesty, more like avoidance, as if the fewer people saw her, the safer she was. Colton searched more on Darrow Holdings. He wasn't surprised. Article after article described their exploitative clauses, lawsuits over murky agreements, customers being pressured into secondary terms. Most articles ended with the same familiar line: insufficient legal basis for action. He sat in silence. He recalled what Logan had said the day before. Sometimes I think she doesn't even leave. If that were true, then Mira wasn't just dedicated, she was trapped. The next morning, Colton arrived even earlier than usual, but Mira had already beaten him there. She was sifting flour, her hands steady but her eyes slightly hollow. He didn't ask anything, but when she set the tray of dough aside, he quietly handed her a hot cup of coffee, without a word. She looked at him for 1 second, then nodded. No thank you. No refusal. But for the first time, she sat down on a wooden stool beside the kitchen counter. Just a few seconds. Then she got up, continued working as if she had never paused. But to Colton, those few seconds were enough to confirm something he now knew without doubt. Mira Caldwell was the kind of woman who never sat down, not because she wasn't tired, but because if she ever stopped, everything might fall apart. Colton didn't show up at the bakery that morning. For the first time since beginning this undercover journey, he chose to step away from the kitchen to pursue a different lead. The night before, after confirming Mira's recurring deduction with Darrow Holdings, he hadn't been able to sleep. There was something in the stillness of her posture, in the way she stared at her phone screen with that old photo, that told him this wasn't just about debt. It was a wound that had never closed. And if he wanted to truly understand it, he had to go backward, into the past. Maple and Sage's data archive office was located in the basement of the company's Chicago headquarters, the same place where he'd signed his first contract, eaten the first test batch of sourdough, and once believed that numbers could replace human stories. He used his executive access code to retrieve files no longer visible in the main system. There, under the folder, Vendor Submissions Rejected, he found a name that made him stop breathing for several seconds. File number 712, Caldwell and Company, March of that year. Attached was a detailed sourdough recipe draft, natural fermentation ratios, optimal proofing time under unstable temperature conditions, hydration index calibrated for high humidity regions. The formatting didn't follow any standard template. It was typed, with handwritten notes in blue ink at the upper right corner. The last line read, "Adapted from our grandfather's starter, preserved since 1964. Colton read every line, every gram, every note describing flavors, designed to remind customers of their first breakfast with their parents. Every detail mirrored the current Maple and Sage sourdough formula, the same one launched that year, which helped elevate the brand to national recognition. He pulled out the company's internal formula to compare. The similarity was nearly identical. From the 36-hour fermentation schedule to the final scoring technique before baking, everything matched. Except one thing: the creator's name. The internal document credited Harvey Benson, then Vice President of Product Development. There was no mention whatsoever of Caldwell and Company. Colton leaned back in his chair. His hands were ice cold. It felt like he had unearthed a secret that should have come to light 8 years ago. He searched for more information on Caldwell and Company. The results showed a small family bakery that had once operated in Chicago's northern Edgewater neighborhood. Owners, Graham Caldwell and Mira Caldwell. No website, no PR campaigns. Just a few scattered local reviews describing it as the best artisan bread I've ever had, or sourdough with the flavor of memory. Then a short article from the Chicago Neighborhood Post appeared with the headline, Caldwell and Company, Bakery Destroyed in Overnight Fire. The publishing date, 1 month after the recipe submission was rejected. The article described the blaze as an electrical fire that occurred at 3:12 a.m., completely gutting the space. No injuries were reported, but all equipment, tools, and records were lost. One key detail stood out. Owner Graham Caldwell had applied for basic insurance coverage, but the claim was denied due to incomplete documentation of the required electrical upgrade. Colton felt a tightening in his chest. He kept searching. A month later, Graham Caldwell's name surfaced again, this time in a brief traffic incident report. Male, approximately 34 years old, pronounced dead after vehicle veered into a highway divider on I-94. The deceased was identified as Graham Caldwell, a resident of Edgewater. Police confirmed the vehicle was privately owned and uninsured. There were no further articles, no investigation. No one asked why. Colton sat still in the archive room, surrounded by the soft hum of servers and the cold reflection of fluorescent lights on the metal desk. Mira had lost her brother just 1 month after losing their bakery. The brother who had co-founded it, the one who wrote the notes in blue ink, who had stood beside her through every step of dough and every early morning batch. And she had applied to Maple and Sage immediately after. He opened her HR file. Application date, 3 weeks after Graham's death. Position applied for, unpaid kitchen assistant. Interview note, only requested to be in the kitchen. Open to any shift. Willing to work nights. No insurance needed. No references provided. Colton felt a chill run down his spine. She hadn't applied for a job to grow. She applied to survive. And that was the exact time Maple and Sage launched its new sourdough line under the slogan, Taste the Heritage. He remembered all the times Mira had declined a raise, declined to appear on the website, declined to be in front of a camera, because every time she saw that bread, she had to remember someone who had been forgotten. And his company, the one that prided itself on kindness and handcrafted values, had stood on someone else's grave. That night, Colton didn't return to his rental room. He went straight to the bakery. Logan was locking up. "You all right?" Logan asked. Colton only nodded, then asked quietly, "Mira still inside?" Logan looked surprised. "She just left, maybe 5 minutes ago." "Why?" Colton didn't answer. He walked into the kitchen, still warm from the last bake. The light from the oven reflected off trays of half-finished dough. On the table was a small notebook, the handwriting round and unfamiliar. Not Mira's, probably Graham's. The page was marked with a piece of old cardboard, corners folded and creased. The final note read, batch number 27, stabilized. Mira said it smells like the old kitchen at home. Colton rested his hand on the page but didn't turn it. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his company no longer felt intact. And for the first time in years, he realized some things couldn't be fixed with bonuses or new contracts. They could only be fixed with truth. Colton had never felt more like a stranger in his own company than he did now. He sat alone in his old office at the Maple and Sage headquarters. The door closed, a dim desk lamp casting a weak glow over the folder he had just retrieved from the senior HR archive. A simple line, sharp as a blade, cut straight through the truth he once believed in. Harvey Benson, Executive Bonus Award, $250,000. For outstanding product innovation, Artisan Heritage, Loaf Line. Signed, 1 month after Graham Caldwell's death. Colton held the performance review for Harvey, the former head of product development, someone he once believed was the kind of man who woke up in the middle of the night dreaming of yeast. In the report, Harvey detailed the development of a handcrafted product line that married traditional techniques with industrial consistency. But in the documents Colton had gathered, specifically the original submission from Caldwell and Company, every word, every formula, echoed with a terrifying resemblance. There was no innovation here, only theft. He placed the printed recipe by Mira and Graham side by side with the one signed by Harvey. Aside from a title change, from Edgewater Starter to Rustic Heritage Base, almost nothing had been altered. The three-phase Levain building process, the cold room fold-in technique, the proofing window, all matched down to the smallest detail. Colton tried to recall that time. He had been traveling abroad for work. Harvey had pitched the new bread line to the executive team in a meeting Colton couldn't attend. And by the time he returned, the bread was already on shelves, praised as the pinnacle of American artisanal baking. He stood and walked to the window, staring down at the company's garden. Once a point of pride for its homegrown herbs used in test recipes, but now all he could see was a thin veneer of ethics over a system built on silence. He felt sick, like he had just consumed something rotten. He turned to the next page in Harvey's file, a transcript from an internal meeting about the sourdough launch. One team member asked about the origin of the idea. Harvey replied, "I was inspired by travels through New England, where I tasted some amazing local loaves. But I refined the idea to match Maple and Sage's technology and philosophy." No one asked anything further. Colton sat back down, his hands flat on the desk, as if to stop himself from standing again. He thought of Mira, small, quiet, her face never demanding anything. A woman who had lost a bakery, a brother, and still baked each morning for the very people who had stolen her work. The rage inside him wasn't fire. It was a slow, expanding crack in concrete. The more you look at it, the deeper it gets. The more you try to ignore it, the more dangerous it becomes. He pulled up internal security footage from that year, videos stored only in restricted systems. In the grainy clip, Graham and Mira entered the main lobby, carrying a wooden box of sample loaves in a folder of documents. Mira said nothing. Graham gestured enthusiastically, explaining something to the receptionist. Moments later, Harvey stepped out, shook hands, accepted the documents and the box. The entire exchange lasted less than 4 minutes. There was no confirmation email, no follow-up from the R&D department. Nothing. Just a brief presentation and then the total erasure of the Caldwell name from every record. Colton clenched his fists. It felt like he was staring at a bloodstain on the dining room wall that he'd walked past for years without ever acknowledging. He pulled up financial records, bonus payouts, budget lines for innovation rewards. Harvey had received 3 bonuses over 2 years, totaling nearly $750,000. Meanwhile, Mira received minimum wage, no bonuses, no acknowledgement of individual contribution, and was still paying off debt to Darrow Holdings, a firm that specialized in post-bankruptcy business recovery loans. He remembered her eyes that morning when she refused small talk, gently repositioned the tray in his hands, and half joked, half instructed, "Don't grip it like you're apologizing to the dough." She didn't need anyone's apology. She needed justice. And now Colton understood the only thing he had left to offer wasn't CEO power or financial spreadsheets. It was the truth. He stood up. No more hesitation. He took off his executive access badge, placed it on the desk, and pulled out his phone. Not to call the board, not to call legal. He called Logan. "Logan, I need to find Mira, but not at the store. Can you tell me which direction she usually goes when she leaves?" Logan hesitated. "She usually bikes north. I'm not sure exactly, but I've seen her head into Edgewater a few times." Edgewater. Colton ended the call and walked briskly out of his office, for the first time feeling like he wasn't walking to lead, but to take responsibility, because no one has the right to profit off someone else's memories, and even less so to let the person who truly created that flavor live in silence. Today, that ends. Colton rode his bike through the Edgewater neighborhood on a breezy afternoon, both hands gripping a stack of papers on the handlebars, as if letting go would cause everything to disappear. Just like how justice had never had a fair chance to exist inside the company he built. He had left everything behind. Meeting schedules, the office, the phone buzzing nonstop in his pocket. At this moment, he was no longer CEO Colton Reyes, but a man carrying a debt. He stopped in front of a small brick house, modest but carefully tended. On the front steps, a silver bicycle was chained securely to the railing with a rusted lock. He hadn't decided what he was going to do when the door opened. Mira stepped out with a paper bag in hand, apparently heading somewhere. She saw him. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't afraid. She simply paused and waited. No apron, no flour on her hands, nothing but a complete calmness on her face. Colton stood upright, as if awaiting judgment. "I'm Colton Reyes," he said, his voice steady but stripped of arrogance. "And I believe I made a very serious mistake." Mira didn't respond, but she didn't shut the door either. He took a step forward and pulled a folder from his coat pocket. "This is a copy of the recipe you and Graham submitted years ago. I can prove it was stolen." She didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply extended her hand to receive it. Each page was turned with great care. Colton said nothing more, only watched each of her movements as though he were witnessing a forgotten documentary unfold. Mira stopped at the page with Graham's note on the hydration percentage, his scribbled handwriting, the kind only someone who had held the hand of a dreamer to the very end could understand. She exhaled, a long breath as if it had been trapped in her chest for years. "He died thinking he failed." Her voice was hoarse. "Do you have any idea how heavy that is?" Colton didn't know how to answer. That question wasn't looking for an excuse or a promise. Mira gently placed the papers down, as if they were the final proof of something sacred. "Graham thought no one believed us, that we were just two amateur bakers. When your company didn't respond, we assumed we weren't good enough. Then the shop burned down. Insurance refused to cover it, and he died a month later. I still remember that night. He drove off without saying a word, and I was in the back trying to fix the dough mixer." Each word she spoke wasn't loud, but like stones dropping into still water, rippling deeper and deeper. Colton stood silent, his hands tightening. "I heard someone once offered to invest in you," he said. Mira nodded slightly. "Yes, a former customer. She said my bread reminded her of her mother. She offered to help me reopen a bakery, even told me I didn't have to repay her." "Why did you say no?" "Because I owe my brother something greater than money." Mira's eyes at that moment seemed to look straight through his coat, aiming for the part of him that logic and pride usually guarded. "I owe Graham recognition. I owe him the truth. I don't need anyone to make amends. I need justice." Colton took a step closer. "I want to do what's right. I can reopen the case, release the documents, expose the person who—" "No," Mira cut him off. She wasn't harsh. She didn't raise her voice, but she was clear. "It's not something you will do. We will. If you truly want to make this right, then you have to walk with me, not ahead of me." He stood still, not used to not leading, but for the first time it felt right. Mira stepped away for a moment and returned with a small wooden box, old but clean. Inside was an old photo, her and Graham standing in front of their first bakery, aprons covered in flour, eyes bright, smiling wide like two kids. Next to it, a notebook. She opened it, flipped to the first page. The first line read, "No bread is artisanal if the hands that make it are disrespected." Mira closed the book and handed it to Colton like an invitation, not for atonement, but for partnership. "Tomorrow I'll be at the bakery at 4:30 a.m. If you want to really begin, be there before I am." There was no nod of agreement from her, no handshake. Only a door gently closed with the quiet resolve of a woman who had waited far too long to be heard. And Colton, for the first time in his life, felt what it meant to be led, without needing to hold the reins. An emergency meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Monday, on the 22nd floor of the Maple and Sage headquarters, in the company's largest conference room, known as Artisan Hall, a space that had once witnessed multi-million-dollar contracts and internal award ceremonies live-streamed across the entire system. But today, there were no pastries on display, no PR staff, and no welcoming laughter. Only 12 large chairs circled a long stone table, harsh white lights bearing down on a stack of documents that Colton Reyes had placed at the center. He wasn't wearing a suit, no tie, just a rolled-up white dress shirt and an expression that signaled he would not tolerate hollow negotiations. At the far end of the table sat the current CEO, Douglas Vane, arms crossed, his face composed but his eyes betraying clear irritation. To his left was Chairwoman Renata Moore, silver-haired, gold-rimmed glasses, the woman who had led Maple and Sage to its IPO. To his right sat CFO Ron Chalmers, the man who treated every company dollar as if it were his own. Surrounding them were senior members, the head of creative, head of supply chain, chief legal counsel, all of whom had a reason to be present, but none fully understood why the meeting had been called with such urgency. Colton was the first to stand. No slideshow, no PowerPoint, just his voice, direct, slow, and clear. In April 2017, a recipe submission from Caldwell and Company was delivered to Maple and Sage, accompanied by a clause stating that if the recipe were used, the submitting party would be compensated at a fair commercial value. 1 month later, the company launched its first sourdough line, branded Heirloom Crust. A soft shuffle was heard at the end of the table as the legal assistant opened the file Colton had placed in front of her. Over the next 4 years, Colton continued, this bread line generated over $38 million in revenue and was widely praised as a product that was artisanal with vision. But today, I'm here to confirm that recipe was not created by Maple and Sage. He flipped the first page. The original handwritten formula by Graham Caldwell. The next, the company's current commercial version. The room fell into silence. Douglas Vane leaned forward. So what exactly do you want, Colton? Why dig up something from the past? This happened during Harvey Benson's tenure. He's no longer with the company. I want nothing for myself, Colton replied, eyes fixed on Douglas. I want recognition. I want Mira Caldwell to be compensated. And I want the board to understand that one of the company's most iconic products was built on an act of theft. There's no binding contract, Ron Chalmers interjected. We didn't sign an agreement with Caldwell and Company. If there was one, legal would have archived it. You should read the appendix section of the original submission, Colton said, sliding a copy in front of Ron. It clearly states, if utilized, the submitter must be notified and compensated per internal policy. That clause was signed by Graham Caldwell and stamped as received by the R&D department. Ron flipped through it. His face drained of color. Renata Moore spoke up. So what's the issue, Colton? If fairness is what you want, we can issue a support payment, a goodwill gesture. No need to escalate. No, Colton said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. This isn't about goodwill. This is about justice. Mira has worked tirelessly at our flagship store for the past 5 years, declined every award, every personal tip, just to stay out of the spotlight and away from her past. Now we have a chance to correct that. The right way. Douglas crossed his arms. And if the board doesn't agree? Colton looked at him directly. Then I will send this entire file, including the original recipe, internal emails, product comparisons, and a voice recording of Mira confirming the facts, to 3 major F&B publications. I don't want to, but I won't let this company keep wearing the artisan label while it continues to profit off someone else's silence. The room froze. No one spoke. The sound of a pen falling from a legal team member startled everyone. The head of creative whispered, I used the story of a mysterious recipe as the theme for last year's campaign. Renata turned to Douglas, her voice low. We can't let this leak. If the media gets involved, the entire brand value collapses. Ron quickly chimed in. I don't think this should go to the shareholder board. We can resolve it internally. Resolve it internally, Colton repeated, means we admit it. He produced a document titled Recipe Ownership Recognition, Mira Caldwell. All it needs is a signature, no press conference, no public apology, just proper compensation and a correction in our internal records. Renata picked it up. Read silently. Set it down. You do realize if we do this, at least 3 other products will have to be reinvestigated. I do, Colton answered. And if necessary, I'll conduct those investigations myself. But we start here. Douglas stood, clearly done with the meeting. I oppose this, but if the majority of the board agrees, I won't block it. The creative director nodded. So did the head of legal. Ron reluctantly raised his hand. 4 out of 7. Colton didn't smile. He didn't thank anyone. He simply gathered the documents, carefully aligning every page like someone protecting a memory from being buried again. As he stepped out of the boardroom, the door behind him didn't slam, but its closing echoed like the final punctuation to an era of convenient erasure, of PR copy written in flour and silence, and the beginning of a new chapter, where bread is baked in truth. The internal meeting on Wednesday morning hadn't been scheduled in advance. A single email had gone out the night before, sent from Colton Ray's address, with a short subject line, acknowledgement. The chosen location wasn't Artisan Hall, as was customary, but a small meeting room tucked behind the main production floor of the flagship store, where sunlight poured through a round window facing the herb garden. It was a room no one ever expected to be used for anything serious. A whiteboard still had handwritten notes from last week's training session. Uneven rise? Check hand temperature. But that morning it became the setting for a moment no one in the room would ever forget. Mira entered at 9:03. She wasn't dressed any differently than usual. Still the same worn apron with her name barely visible, her hair tied up neatly, and a silver-gray sweater frayed at the elbows. But there was something different in how she stood. Not the posture of someone attending a meeting, but of someone about to testify. The room held 10 people. Monica, the flagship store manager, who was usually too busy managing inventory to sit still for more than 3 minutes. Logan, the morning shift lead, still wearing the flower-speckled shirt from his last batch. Representatives from the marketing team, a regional operations director, and 2 newly promoted staff members from last week. Colton stood in the corner, not seated, not speaking. He only gave a small nod when Mira looked in his direction, a silent gesture of permission. Mira stepped to the center of the room, placed both hands on the edge of the table, began. I know some of you are probably wondering why I'm here, why someone who never attends meetings suddenly wants to speak. And I don't blame you for that. For the past 4 years, I've placed myself in the kind of role people are allowed to forget, and I did that on purpose. But today, I need to speak. Not for me, for my brother, Graham Caldwell. She took a deep breath, then continued, still steady, clear and unwavering. Graham and I opened a small bakery called Caldwell and Company, just south of Portland. We had nothing but a manual oven and a few family recipes handed down from our grandfather. When we submitted our sourdough formula to Maple and Sage, we knew the odds were slim, but Graham believed that if someone tasted it, they would recognize something you can't buy in a bag of flour, something that comes from trust and sincerity. We were excited when we received a confirmation of receipt, and we were devastated beyond words when, a month later, the company launched a product almost identical to ours, with no one ever contacting us again. She paused. For a few seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of the air vent above. 3 weeks later, our shop burned down. We lost everything. Graham lost control while driving on the highway, and the accident happened. I applied to work at Maple and Sage the very week the new product hit the shelves. I needed to know for sure, and I did. But I had no proof, and I had no strength to fight. I just wanted to honor his memory. Mira looked around the room. Logan lowered his eyes. Monica sat still, as if seeing a part of the truth she had never thought to question. Mira continued. When Colton came to me and showed me the original formula, I didn't cry. I didn't accuse anyone. I just remembered something Graham used to say, that if someday someone ate that recipe with belief, then it had lived again. But to live doesn't mean to stay silent, and I can't stay silent anymore. She reached into her pocket and placed a piece of paper on the table. It was the original recipe, the one that still bore Graham's handwriting with a final line added at the bottom. Let them taste dignity, not just dough. Colton offered me compensation, a large amount, but I don't need millions. I just want my brother's name restored to what he created. And I want this company, not just Maple and Sage, but the young people learning to bake everywhere, to understand that ideas are not things you take for free. No one moved. Monica started to cry, not loudly but with wet eyes and both hands clasped over her chest, as if trying to hold back something rising from deep within. A marketing team member quietly placed a hand on her shoulder. Mira said nothing more. She gave a small nod, then turned and walked out of the room. Colton stepped forward, said nothing. He simply picked up the paper Mira had left behind, as if it wasn't just a recipe, but a reminder that sometimes what is right doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be heard, clearly, honestly, and at the right moment. And the meeting ended without a resolution, without applause, without any official decision recorded. But something had been noted, not on paper, but in the eyes of everyone present. A quiet kind of change, irreversible in its weight. The vote was scheduled for Friday afternoon during a special session of the Board of Directors at Maple and Sage's Seattle headquarters. That week, there had been no internal newsletter, no product launch emails, no marketing campaigns pushed out. The entire company seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to be rewritten. The conference room on the 12th floor, typically reserved for quarterly growth strategy meetings or franchise contract approvals, had become, on that day, a place not of numbers, but of collective reckoning. Colton arrived early, carrying a thick folder, though he didn't open it. He had done everything that needed to be done in the days leading up to this moment, providing evidence, calling each board member personally, resending the original contract with Graham Caldwell's intellectual property clause. Now he simply sat there, not as a leader, but as a silent witness. The center seat was reserved for board chairwoman Marion Qualls, a woman who had guided the company through 3 major crises and who had also signed off on the sourdough product line that fateful year. She didn't hide the tension in her face. Beside her was CFO Richard Lane, the only board member to publicly oppose Colton's proposal. In his view, what had happened was regrettable, but allowing personal emotion to set a precedent would threaten the entire operational model. The vote began after a short, emotionless restatement from Colton, listing only the facts. The recipe was submitted by Graham Caldwell. The current product matches 97% of the original formula. Mira Caldwell, the only surviving individual tied to the authorship, has worked relentlessly at the flagship store for the past 4 years, declined all raises, declined public recognition, not out of modesty, but for a singular reason, to protect her brother's legacy. And now, after everything, the company must choose, to stay silent or to acknowledge. When Marion raised her hand to call the vote, the room went completely still. 8 ballots. One by one, members raised their hands. Monica went first. Her hand trembled slightly, but it did not lower. Next was a younger member, recently promoted from Regional Director of the West, someone who had watched Mira arrive at the bakery at 4 a.m. every morning. Then came 3 more votes. When it came to Richard Lane, he looked around, then kept his hand down. Marion paused, looked at Colton, then raised her hand, slowly but firmly. 6 out of 8. The motion passed. Mira would have her remaining debt with Darrow Holdings, the finance company that had deducted from her paychecks for the past 3 years, fully cleared. Graham Caldwell's name would be officially acknowledged in the recipe database, featured on the company website and printed on product packaging. And Mira Caldwell would be appointed to a newly created position, Director of Artisan Baking Innovation, with quarterly profit-sharing rights and a 5-year contract. Colton said nothing. He simply nodded, his eyes slightly red but unblinking. Marion stood, took a deep breath, and announced, "Mira Caldwell will be invited to speak if she wishes." No one expected Mira to show, but she did. At exactly 3:27 p.m., her same old bicycle parked outside, her gray sweater and tied-up hair unchanged. She didn't take a seat but stood directly behind Colton. When invited to speak, she took just 2 steps forward, stood upright, and looked slowly around the room. No prepared speech, no notes. Her voice was calm but strong enough that each person felt it strike the part of them they had never voiced aloud. "I don't know what to say at moments like this, because honestly, I never imagined this day would come. But if there's anything I want to say, it's simply this. Thank you for not choosing silence. And thank you for letting my brother's name return to where it belonged. I'm not happy, not because I don't appreciate this, but because I understand that some things, even when corrected, can never start over. But this time, at least I don't have to stay silent anymore." No one replied to that, but in the eyes of those present, something had been released. Not joy, not relief, but a kind of quiet justice, the kind that happens when someone is finally heard, not by shouting, not by winning, but by truth being accepted. Mira left the boardroom in silence. She didn't shake hands. She didn't look back. But those who remained in the room were no longer the same. And as she rode her bike past the small garden behind headquarters, a group of young staff members having lunch looked up. They didn't know the full story, But they had heard parts of it, through Monica, through Colton, through the latest internal memo. And one of them nodded gently in her direction, as if to say, I know who you are. 2 weeks after the board's vote, a light rain fell steadily over Boston, each drop tapping gently against the sixth-floor windows of Maple and Sage's headquarters. In the newly rearranged office of Colton, no longer the CEO, now officially founder in strategic transition, there was an unusual calm. No urgent emails, no last-minute performance calls, only the soft light from a desk lamp, the ticking of an old wall clock marking steady time, and the faint sound of rain trailing down the smooth glass. Colton sat there not as an executive, but as someone waiting for something that mattered more than numbers or authority. And that something arrived, not with grandeur, not with noise. It arrived in 3 quiet, evenly spaced knocks at the door. Mira stepped in, wearing the same round-collar white blouse, dark slacks, and flat shoes. No makeup, no accessories, just Mira, as always. But her eyes were different. They were no longer the quiet eyes of someone enduring, nor the cold gaze of someone weathered by too much loss. These were the eyes of someone who had spoken the truth, had been heard, and finally, had been respected. In her hands was a silvery gray fabric bag, its seams slightly frayed, folded carefully as if every corner held weight. Without a word, Mira walked slowly to the desk, placed the bag down, nudged it toward Colton, and sat opposite him. Colton looked at the bag as if it were alive. Something in Mira's gaze made him hesitate to open it. It belonged to my brother, Mira said, her voice not loud, not soft, just enough to resonate in the still room. It survived the fire. I've kept it hidden for 10 years. Colton unclasped the cloth with care. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound, its front cover heavily singed on the lower left edge, the first page dotted with burns, and the scent of smoke still faintly lingering. He opened it. The inner pages were handwritten, bold and steady, the handwriting of Graham. On each recipe were small, softer notes in a different hand, likely Mira's, with comments like, use natural starter if temp drops below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or, if using a home oven, bake 5 minutes longer at the end. This wasn't just a recipe book. It was a journal of 2 siblings, a journey unnoticed by the world, recorded in flour, water, and meticulous devotion to detail. Colton turned each page. Some were stuck together, others had torn edges, but none were missing. Several formulas were repeated. Sourdough Spring 2008, version 4, with quick remarks beside them. Collapsed in the middle, crust too thick, try lowering heat. Some entries even noted feelings. Customers said it's better than the bakery down the street. Graham smiled all morning. Near the end, there was one page Colton couldn't take his eyes off. The paper had yellowed more than the others, likely the only page Graham rewrote after the bakery's intellectual property bid was denied. The handwriting here was no longer steady. There were strike-throughs, repeated words. But right in the center, written in deep blue ink, stood the words, give credit, even if no one's watching. Colton froze. His hand stayed resting on the notebook. No one said anything for a long time. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. Mira sat across from him, silent, her gaze fixed beyond the window, as if listening to a song only she could hear. He wrote that after the rejection, Mira said, without waiting for Colton to ask. I remember it. That day he sat for hours, didn't say a word, then pulled out the notebook and wrote exactly that, then closed it and never opened it again. I didn't read it, not until after the accident. Colton swallowed hard. In that moment, every report, every brand strategy, every board meeting seemed laughably small. None of it carried the weight of one handwritten line, scorched yet intact. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed, probably both. Mira stood. I'm not keeping it anymore, she said. It needs to be where people don't just read it, but act on it. Colton wanted to object, to say the notebook should remain with her, but looking into her eyes, he understood. This wasn't about ownership. It was about returning. She had kept it alive in silence for 10 years. Now it was time for it to be spoken aloud, publicly, and heard by those who had once chosen silence. He nodded, carefully folded the notebook closed, and placed it on the desk. Not in a safe, not in a drawer. The notebook sat there, its final page exposed, the sentence glowing under the soft yellow light. Give credit, even if no one's watching. That afternoon, Colton canceled all his meetings. He didn't go home. He didn't leave the office. He just sat there, reading every page of that notebook as if retracing the life of someone he had once unknowingly buried beneath a brand name. And he made a vow. There would never be another Graham forgotten. There would never be another Mira working 14-hour days just to remain silent. No recipe, no idea, no pair of hands would ever again be considered a nameless auxiliary. That night he began writing a completely new introduction to Maple and Sage's brand journal. No new logo, no trim slogan, just one passage. We exist because of those who were never asked to be remembered. It's time we write their names down, one by one. Everything inside the bakery remained the same. The soft golden light still streamed through the old glass windows. The dark wooden tables still carried the scent of flour and coffee every morning, and the wind chime at the door still rang gently each time someone entered. But there was one small change, and it was enough to make the entire room breathe differently. On the wall behind the pastry counter, right beside the photo frames of staff from past years, hung a small brass plaque. It didn't shine. There was no spotlight. But no one walked into the bakery without noticing it. The engraving was simple yet respectful. In honor of Graham Caldwell, artisan and dreamer. No one knew who had mounted the plaque. Some said it was Colton. Others believed it was Mira. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was there. A belated yet sincere response to someone once forgotten behind a half-burned door and pages of pitch decks no one ever read to the end. Mira said nothing that morning. She simply paused, looked at the plaque for a few seconds, then returned to rolling dough as if nothing had happened. But everyone noticed that day. Her dough was thinner than usual, more even, and the aroma from the oven lingered longer than on any other morning. Mira was no longer the woman who never sits down. She still rose at 4 a.m., still rode her old bicycle quietly to the back of the shop, but she no longer avoided the gaze of others. She trained new staff with her own hands, not only teaching them how to fold dough edges to trap air, but also why a baker should speak less and feel more with their hands. Dough doesn't like haste, she once told a new intern, and that boy, after burning his first batch, asked to stay late without pay just to learn how to hold the dough without letting it deflate. Amber, who once harbored envy toward Mira, was now the first to show up for her afternoon training sessions. No more sly remarks, no more cold stares. Amber began to truly listen. She asked Mira how one could tell when it was time to stop stirring. Mira didn't answer immediately. That day she let Amber stir until her arms ached and tears welled up from realizing the mixture had spoiled. Then Mira smiled softly, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Next time, don't let your hands work alone. Let your heart help them." One morning, as Mira was arranging loaves on the shelf, a small group entered. They didn't order anything. They weren't holding phones like tourists or food bloggers. They just stood there watching Mira for a long moment until one of them, a young brown-skinned woman with carefully braided hair, stepped forward and said, "You probably don't remember me, but 3 years ago, every Monday, I had early morning classes and passed by here. Each time there was a small loaf left on the outside table. No name, no note. But I ate it every week and never missed a class, even when all I had left in my wallet were coins. Today we've all graduated, we've started working, but we never forgot that taste. So we came back to say thank you." Mira said nothing. She simply nodded, her gaze softening, then reached behind the counter for a special sourdough loaf, set it on the table and said, "This one has a name. It's called Hope." Colton still visited the shop every week, not to check on it, but to learn. He no longer wore suits. A white shirt and sneakers were enough to keep him from feeling out of place. He no longer walked in as an owner, but as someone relearning how to listen from the beginning. Once he asked Mira, "What made you stay after everything?" Mira didn't look at him. She simply picked up a small piece of paper, wrote a few words, folded it, and handed it to him before returning to the oven. Colton opened it. The note read, "Because I once wasn't recognized, so I want to be the first who never forgets." Mira's story spread quietly. No major articles, no viral clips. But those who had ever heard of Graham Caldwell began mentioning his name again. A small food blog posted a piece titled The Forgotten Loaf, recounting the revival of the original sourdough recipe and Maple and Sage's formal recognition of its true creator. Not long after, a group of culinary students applied for internships at the flagship shop, not for the brand's reputation, but to learn from the woman who once baked an apology into a loaf of bread. By the end of the day, Mira was still Mira, but the bakery was no longer the same. Every loaf now had a tiny symbol pressed into the bottom crust. Small letters, GC, subtle enough that only the observant would notice. Mira never explained the symbol to anyone, but Colton understood, and those who had tasted the bread here before could feel the difference. Not because of the ingredients, but because, for the first time, this bakery had made something people didn't just bite into, but felt. 3 weeks after the pivotal vote on the 42nd floor, a letter appeared on the desk of every employee at Maple and Sage. Not an email, not a formal memo. A handwritten letter in deep blue ink, sealed with wax bearing the company's old logo, a broken loaf of bread. Inside was a short note from Colton Reyes. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't corporate. It was so blunt that readers looked up more than once, as if to make sure they had read it right. We forgot what makes a company like Maple and Sage. It's not the systems, not the processes, not the quarterly meetings. It's people like Graham Caldwell, people who ask for nothing more than to be seen. If we don't protect the ones who make the product, then this company is just a plagiarism factory with an assembly line. 1 week later, Mira Caldwell, now the creative director of Artisan Bakes, stood on a small wooden platform at the flagship branch, a place that used to be nothing more than a sleek, lifeless retail space, to announce a new initiative called Real Bakers First. It wasn't a marketing campaign, not a PR stunt outsourced to an agency. It was a collaborative platform that allowed any baker, whether a student, a single mother, or someone who had failed before, to submit their recipe, their story, and their process to the company's system. If selected, the recipe would carry the name of its creator, not a product manager, not the brand itself, but the individual who would receive royalties and be honored publicly. Mira didn't give a speech. She simply told the story of the first time she and her brother kneaded dough by hand in a cramped kitchen during the first winter after their parents passed. She spoke about how Graham had written dozens of emails to the company asking for someone to evaluate his recipe. She recalled how they had once shared their first sourdough loaf, eyes sparkling like two kids who thought they'd just invented something grand. She paused, then looked at the audience with a steady gaze and said, "We don't need praise. We just need not to be robbed." The room fell silent. A young intern standing in the back corner quietly wiped away tears. A middle-aged woman, a bakery owner from Kansas City, nodded as if she had waited 10 years to hear those words. After the ceremony, Mira returned to the baking area in the back, checking ovens, tasting dough, adjusting temperatures. No one asked her to. She simply couldn't live any other way. Colton arrived late. No suit, no assistant. He stood at a distance as if witnessing a slow wind returning the soul to a company he once believed had turned to stone. He didn't come to make a speech. He just wanted to hand Mira something. A small brass plaque, unpolished, unpretentious. On it, a few simple words were engraved. In honor of Graham Caldwell, artisan, dreamer, brother. Mira looked at the plaque, then at Colton. No smile, no tears. She just nodded, gently touched the worn edge of the metal, and hung it herself on the red brick wall behind the pastry counter, where morning sunlight always hit first. 1 month later, Maple and Sage began receiving hundreds of recipes from all over America. A 15-year-old boy from El Paso submitted his oatmeal cookie recipe made with his grandmother. A homeless man from Chicago sent a handwritten note attached to a recipe with the words, "I don't have an oven, but I remember this by heart." An elderly woman in Alabama wrote down her late husband's entire bread recipe with a final line that read, "I don't want money. I just don't want his name forgotten." Mira read every single one. She didn't pick the most unique or the most shocking. She picked the ones with a soul, with breath, with a real person behind every gram of flour. One afternoon, Colton walked into the office and saw Mira reviewing a recipe with burnt edges, a photocopy from a weathered notebook. He asked, Still keeping that one? She answered, not because it's the perfect recipe, but because it's the last time he believed someone would read it the right way. Colton looked at the notebook and said, what if the next gram doesn't have to burn before being seen? Mira nodded. Then we finally built a kitchen, not a factory. The story didn't end with fireworks. There were no sudden spikes in revenue, no viral hashtags, but in a small bakery in East Portland, once merely a high-end retail point, you could now hear laughter, ovens clicking on early, and someone teaching an intern how to nurture yeast like caring for a living being. And there, hung higher than eye level so everyone had to look up to read it, was a small brass plaque. The story no longer belonged to a company. It belonged to a brother, a sister, and hundreds of quiet bakers who were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, their names deserved to be remembered too. And if you believe a recipe can be stolen, then you must also believe recognition can be restored. Graham is gone, but his name has returned. Not as a legend, but as a forgotten artisan finally remembered. As for Mira, she didn't ask for money, didn't crave fame. She only wanted one thing. Don't stay silent when the ones who create beauty are pushed aside. This story isn't just about a loaf of bread. It's about dignity, about fairness, about someone daring to say, enough. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever seen someone robbed of credit, or if you simply believe that ideas deserve respect, leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you wanted to speak up. And if you believe in kindness, in quiet justice, in the power of stories like this, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We restore value, one story at a time.